Welcome, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Something really spectacular is happening in the philanthropic space, and particularly in neuroscience philanthropy. And we're going to spend about an hour talking about that up here. The bad news, as everyone knows, is that the government has really fallen down on the job just when we need all the help we can get. And of course, historically, the federal government in the United States has done so much for basic research and helping us find a way to overcome the scientific challenges that we face and the medical challenges. And the bad news is that's just not happening now. We're facing bigger challenges than ever, and really the federal government is not stepping up to the plate, sadly. The good news is that there are some really innovative, spirited things happening in the philanthropic space, and also in the realm of public-private partnerships, or maybe we should call them private-public partnerships. And many of those innovations are actually represented here on stage with us today. So I'm going to try to actually stay out of the way because we have such an interesting panel. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. You may know from reading their bios online that we could take one person and just go through their bio and spend an hour doing that. There's just the credibility and the life history and the ideas are that deep up here. So I'm going to do the bio portion very quickly with apologies to them, and then we'll start what I think is going to be a really fascinating conversation. Bill Solomon to my left is Dmitry V. D'Arbeloff, MBA class of 1955, professor of business administration and senior associate dean for external relations at Harvard Business School. Henry McCants to his left is chairman emeritus of Greylock Partners and co-founder of Cure Alzheimer's Fund, which I also work for. Meryl Comer to Henry's left is president of the Jeffrey Bean Foundation Alzheimer's Initiative. Nancy Frates to her left is a director of the Pete Frates III Fund and a mastermind of the already legendary ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. That's right, absolutely. Stephen Tregay to her left is CEO of Forma Therapeutics. We'll be learning more about that in a second. And last, but of course not least, is Jeff Walker, vice chair, among other things, vice chair of the United Nations Envoy's Office for Health, Finance, and Malaria. And before I jump in here with the first round of questions, let me remind you that we'd love to take your questions. You probably already know this, but if you go to yorn.com, that's yorn.com/WMIF, and you select session 216, you can put in a comment or question, and some of those comments will wind their way up to my device up here, and hopefully I can integrate some of those into our conversation. So, Bill, let's start with you. I've hinted at this in my brief introduction, but you are enmeshed in this world. You've got deep background. Help us with, not to make you sound old, but you know what you're talking about.
It's a low bar.
Tell us what's changed, in the big picture from a generation ago, philanthropy-wise, to the nonprofits we're seeing today, and then we'll get some specific examples of that as we go down the line.
Great. Look, you commented about the stress in NIH spending. The level is down in real terms. That's problematic. It turns out how they spend their money is perhaps even more problematic. And so what we're observing are patients and their loved ones who look at the system. They've not been part of the system, and they say, this system is not organized to create the outcomes that we want. We want cures. We don't care what university you're at. We don't care whether you're at a startup or a big pharma company. We don't care whether you're an assistant professor, an associate professor, or where you have published your papers. We care about making progress to the clinic. And so what people have done is to create virtual outcome-focused organizations where they have reversed engineered how to overcome some of the basic barriers to progress that exist in the current system. So they're willing to back great people with high potential but potentially risky ideas. They demand that people collaborate, that they share information, that they keep in mind what the prize is, what they're trying to accomplish. And they do everything in their world to engage patient communities so that the patient communities both trust the organizations and are prepared to cooperate in ways that dramatically accelerate or improve the potential. So that's the new kind of philanthropy. It's not send money to a passively to an organization. It's about actually trying to create a new kind of organization that will be far more effective, far more like a meritocracy we see in the real world. And that's what you see represented here.
Right, I would ask you for an example, but we have example, and that's what we're going to be doing the deep dive now. So, Henry, I'll pretend I don't know anything about Cure Alzheimer's Fund. Tell us how it got started and how it's a little bit or a lot different from some of the philanthropies we've known from the past.
Well, thank you, and Chris and MGH, thanks for putting this forum together and letting us have this panel. Just by way of a little personal background, I was fortunate enough, and I am the oldest man on this panel, I'm sure of that. I was fortunate enough to join Greylock and become a partner in the venture capital industry way back in 1969 when nobody knew what the term meant, when it was a cottage industry. And I had the privilege of working in Greylock Partners and in the venture capital industry for 45 years and watched it mature into what is today a very important asset class in the United States. And through that lens, I have been able to see and observe and participate firsthand in the power that comes from harnessing truly world-class visionary entrepreneurial talent with proper VC funding. It has created companies that we all know have changed our lives every day. Think Apple Computer, think Facebook, think LinkedIn. It has created whole new industries. The biotech industry was basically started by the venture capital industry with Genentech and Amgen and Genetics Institute in the late 1970s. In 2000, my wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, a disease I knew nothing about. But I was lucky enough to live in Boston, and I visited with her all of the leading teaching hospitals in the city. And I was shocked, really, to hear the same advice. Try 3 Advil a day. It might help her. Try Lipitor, a drug approved by the FDA for a totally different condition. It might help her. And oh, yes, there's some FDA-approved drugs like Aricept or Reminol. They treat the symptoms briefly. They won't really help her. Now, as a venture capitalist who had seen the progress that I've described in the for-profit world, this was simply an unacceptable piece of news for me, because this wasn't for an orphan disease that affected 1,000 people in this country. As you all know, it affects 5.5 million Americans today. This wasn't for a newly discovered disease. Alzheimer's was discovered over 100 years ago. And so I co-founded Cure Alzheimer's Fund to try and take some of the venture capital best practices and apply them to doing breakthrough research for the disease that had affected my family personally. In some ways, the venture capital model, I need to get out of the way right here, is a little unfortunate term because some people ask me, well, you're trying to make money from this. No, Cure Alzheimer's Fund is totally a nonprofit dedicated to improving mankind and improving the dealing with this very important disease. But what I mean by venture capital practices are very simple. Number one, as Bill alluded to, the truly great venture capitalists are proactive. They don't sit at their desk or their computer and react to detailed business plans and say this one's good and this one won't make it. Instead, we're proactive. We go out, we network, and we try and meet and identify really visionary talents in the fields that we're interested in investing in. And we say to them, Mark, when you're ready to raise venture capital for Facebook, and this is a true example in the case of Greylock, think of Greylock. So we proactively go out and identify an individual and network and then lead to an investment. Next, we're not a passive investor. We're very active. We try and make the investments better in a small way. And thirdly, and fairly importantly, we don't do incremental 5%, 10% faster, better, cheaper investments. We try and go for the long pass, the 20-yard pass that will be transformational in nature. So when we started Cure Alzheimer's Fund, we just applied those principles. We went out and proactively identified some of the leading academic researchers in institutions around the country. We recruited Rudy Tanzi, who's been a big part of the conference the last 2 days, to be our head chairman of our research consortium, and he helped us recruit 11 or 12 other researchers, such as David Holzman at WashU and Sam Sodi at University of Chicago, and I can go on. And we said to them, we have chosen you, we're going to fund you. Now, give us your most ambitious, higher risk projects that you can't get funded from lower risk other sources. And then we said to them one final thing, which was, for all the goodness that we're giving you, you don't need to compete for funds, we've chosen you. Venture capitalists hate bureaucracy, give us a 2-pager and we'll have the funds in your hands, hopefully in a matter of months. And really do the projects that you want to do, the ones that are higher risk but potentially higher reward. There is a catch, and it comes back to something Bill said. You must collaborate with each other. You must truly function like a dream team. And we at Cure Alzheimer's will facilitate that by having quarterly webinars and once a year an in-person, in-depth meeting with all of you where you push each other, share confidential data, push each other thinking, and help us prioritize with one another what are the most important projects for the next year. I'll stop there, but that is the basic model for our nonprofit.
And we'll get even further into it. Thank you. It's inspiring. So, Meryl, you're also in the Alzheimer's space, and I as an interviewer, I'm embarrassed by this question, but I think we're talking about you're also doing some very innovative stuff in a very different way. So I'm just going to ask you comparatively, how would you contrast what you're doing with what Henry's doing, and then tell us more about the Jeffrey Bean Foundation initiative?
Well, we start from a similar space, and I would say to the audience, scratch the surface of our lives, and right beneath the surface is their pain, and it's typically around disease that you can't escape. And in our case, it was Alzheimer's. My husband was chief of hem-onc at NIH, and at 57, 20 years ago, he got early onset Alzheimer's and was misdiagnosed systematically. I left my career to take care of him. No one wanted us. So I have come from a place of pain, and I still take care of my husband 20 years later. So I have learned over those 20 years that it's not the pain, it's what you do with the pain that matters, and to make it purposeful. So I became this fearless advocate in a space because when you fight a disease for which there is no cure or no disease-modifying therapy, whatever you do, you know the disease is going to win at home. And I needed to fight it on another playing field. And that's how I came outside into the advocacy world. Now, someone bet on me. I went to brief a trustee of another foundation in New York, sat down, was talking advocacy, and he said, I have a better idea for you. How would you like to create a foundation? Oh, I said, I've managed boards. I said, I'll do the homework. I tried to talk him out of repeating a model, but he needed a 501c3 because Jeffrey Bean is a unique type of philanthropy. I could dress all the gentlemen in this room from head to toe in Jeffrey Bean, and 100% of the net profits of the company, which is a menswear licensed globally, 100% of the net profits fund philanthropy. So we are big in the cancer space because the designer Jeffrey Bean died of cancer, but we were a foundation that they wanted to create because one of the employees had had Alzheimer's. So I was given a blank sheet of paper and wrote my vision at night, taking care of a man, my husband, who had known me for years. I went to the cutting edge of science because I felt the care space was saturated. To be very honest, I was escaping to the future. I didn't want any family to have to live the way I had lived. I wanted women to have better options and not be forced to leave their careers. Although 20 years later, nothing has changed. So I was able to write a vision about a future that pushed the edge of innovation in science, and also, because my background is in media, try to reframe scientific issues in a way that could be embraced publicly. So that was my way of managing, because I'm not a scientist, which makes me very dangerous and highly creative. So but I'm much better than having to write a grant to the NIH, I'll tell you that. I'm more fun, I hope.
Thank you. Nancy, I just realized that I planned very poorly. The obvious end to this panel would be all of us with turning around and getting the buckets of ice and following through, although I have
If you give
not-
them enough warning, I think they
I
could
was
probably
gonna
prep
say.
that over in the,
Right,
the
well,
drink
maybe,
room.
yeah, okay, so maybe it'll still happen. I guess if someone pressured me on camera, I haven't had the guts to do it yet, but thank you again for this extraordinary idea, and I think it's opened the eyes of everyone who is in philanthropy, not just the brilliance of the idea, but in letting us all know that there's just, there are new ideas out there that haven't been discovered, and how to tap into people's passion and sense of warmth and sense of humanity. People want to give, they want to be a part of something big, and you really tapped into that. So please tell us about your story, and about your son who couldn't be here today, but we invited him. He wanted to be here, I know.
Yeah. So thank you, and thank you for those that have, you all have told my story. So in March of 2012, we were told that our 27-year-old son had ALS. And Pete, just a little background, high-level Division I athlete in top peak condition, and it was sporadic ALS. And I tell the story that when we were told he had ALS, okay, ALS, and I call it, your knowledge Rolodex. When this topic came up, ALS, okay, what do I know about ALS? And honestly, I came up with two things. I knew it was bad, not real sure, the degree, and I knew Lou Gehrig was 75 years ago. So my question, of course, being a parent, next was, okay, what do we do? What's the treatment? What's the cure? Because I hadn't really no other knowledge of the disease. And that's what really has catapulted my family into this arena. The word unacceptable. That's all I came up with. This is unacceptable. 75 years ago, probably the best baseball player that ever lived stood, but then I come to find out that 98% of the people in Yankee Stadium that day had no idea what Lou Gehrig actually had. The second thing that we knew that we were battling was awareness. Just exactly what I said. People had heard ALS, they knew Lou Gehrig, but did they really know what ALS was? Did they really understand the reality of the journey of the ALS patient? And the other thing that we were battling was time. Because after I was told that my 27-year-old son didn't have a treatment or a cure, I was told that his prognosis was 3 to 5 years with a rapid progression, or maybe not rapid because they couldn't tell us. We'd have to wait and see how it unfolded. That his muscles were going to be slowly taken away from him and all his physical attributes. So that night, it was actually Pete Frates that said to us, okay, we're not going to ask why. I've been given this. We're going to deal with it, and we're going to get it in front of philanthropists. And that was the thing that he said, I'm going to get this disease in front of Bill Gates. And that was it. We're business people. So we just said, we knew that if we raised awareness, that we're going to, our model, it's funny, I was thinking about our model. Our model was back to basics. It was stories. It was people understanding and seeing our story and relating to it. So we really, the next day, my husband and I, first we thought we'd go back to medical school because if they can't figure it out, we were, because that's what a parent's first reaction is. We didn't have time. The second thing was, well, we could stop picking the phone up and just start calling people and asking for money, right? Can you give money to ALS? But we knew we would probably spend half our time just describing what ALS was. And so we just felt that if we could raise the awareness, people would open their hearts and then they'd open their wallets. Now, in tandem with that, I have a remarkable son. My son lived 27 years being a leader, a mentor, a captain. And I always say that people lead in different ways. Pete led with kindness and by example. And as a joke, we used to laugh because whenever we would bring someone's name up, Pete would say, oh, that's my buddy's buddy. That's my buddy. And we'd be rolling our eyes. Okay, Pete, we know that you know that. And my older daughter would say, can you just tell him to stop name dropping? And Pete gets this disease. And within a week, we are supported by legions of people. Guess what? He knew all those people. He was a master networker. He was a master at maintaining and valuing relationships. So all those people that he had led, that he had worked with, all came back and said, it is unacceptable, Pete. We are going to stand by you. So for the past 3 years, that's what we did. We just cultivated our networks. We just told Pete's story. We encouraged other ALS patients to do the same thing. And in end of July, Pete had been mentoring a young man out in Long Island called Pat Quinn. Pat was almost parallel to Pete, same age, girlfriend, soon-to-be wife, diagnosed with ALS. And he said to Pat, you have to go home. You have to create, you have to shout from the highest mountain that this is what you have. And you have to be out there showing people your journey so that they get invested in your journey and see the unacceptability of it. So Pat called Pete at the end of July and he said, something's just come across my Facebook page. Pete, I think this is it. The Ice Bucket Challenge had been kind of going around social media for different causes during the summer of all of last summer. But when Pete and Pat saw it, they became purposeful and they became strategic. So in those early days, they knew that they had to send it in their generation, the way they did it, where we might have gone and knocked on doors and picked up the phone, they went straight to social media. And that's what they did. And they knew that we had to tag people. They knew we had to, like, look, I got a real quick education in social media in those first couple of days because Pete had directed us to engage at a high level on social media. So every time someone posted an Ice Bucket Challenge in those first couple of days, he told us to like, comment, share. Then he told us to tag people of influence. Pete was writing emails to professional sports players that he knew, saying, this is coming your way. Can you take a look at it? Can you help promote it? Because he knew it was all about the story. So that, people want to make it about putting water over the head. They want to make it about social media. Yes, those were the vehicles. It goes back to basics. It's the story. It's people to people. It's the way you live your life. And it's taking an unacceptable situation, as both of my predecessors here had said, and said, we're going to do something about it, and turning that pain and challenge into something proactive. And one of the other things, which is hard to do when you're in the throes of the disease, but it's to wake up every day full of positivity and full of hope, to know that if I am proactive today, something will happen. Something did happen. So now this rare disease, which now we're looking at, if are we this rare? My son asked Dr. Merit Zukovich on his first visit with Merit, how much do you need? How much do you need to cure this? And she said, I need $1 billion, Pete. So he's raised $220 million to this point. We've made that promise. We're going to keep going. But Alzheimer's has come out, ALS has come out of the shadows. This horrific, humiliating disease, now people have educated themselves to what it is. So we're very, very hopeful that this will help. But that's our model. Our model was pretty basic.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Thank you for the story. Now, Stephen, in a way, as interesting and important as everyone is up here, in a way, you're really our guy. We should almost have you like a couple feet, above everyone, because we all want cures, and we're not going to get cures without some really innovative work on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. And you're here to tell us about how these various models, and I'm sure some more, can take this idea of public-private partnership to a new level.
Sure.
So welcome.
So
and
first,
tell us
thank
about
you
your story.
to everybody, and it's just an honor to be here. So it's a real honor to be on stage with all of you. So I am a scientist. I am passionate about discovering drugs, and that is ultimately the thing that connects the passion that you hear today from everyone to something that can make a difference, whether it's monoclonals or small molecule therapies. I founded a company in biologics. I'll talk about Forma, which is the company that I founded and I'm currently CEO of. And what we really look to do is really take and transform the drug discovery paradigm. So classically, drug discovery has been almost a commercial driven, you need cholesterol lowering, et cetera, and you work backwards in an attrition-based model that costs billions of dollars to bring a drug to market and is incredibly challenging. But the power of drug discovery technologies today and what Forma has been able to build, so we founded this company in 2008, which was an interesting and exciting time, to say the least, in founding a company. But what it really enabled us to do was integrate a lot of drug discovery technologies so we could operate on scale. And what this allows us to do is not work on one target that we have quote unquote validated. And one of the great challenges in connecting biology to disease physiology is the appropriate nature of tool compounds. The disease complexes that we're looking at, kind of broadly often work with multi-protein complexes, enzymatic functions, scaffolding functions. Teasing that biology apart is a critically challenging job. A lot of the venture philanthropy dollars go into funding amazing research, but it needs the tools to really be able to then rigorously prioritize that. And I'm very passionate about that research goes to the right dollars. Even if I give a high quality tool compound that disproves a theory, simply that ability to then focus those dollars into other more productive areas can be incredibly valuable. Obviously, the value is greatest when we can transform a patient's life. So we work broadly in target families. We collaborate massively around this. And we've been able to build a very paradigm shifting drug discovery company. We've raised $45 million in venture money. We've worked with lots of different disease foundations. We've focused a lot in cancer, but we're very excited to collaborate outside that space. We've done over 100 targets in drug discovery to date, and we look to really get to those compounds. And what I would also say is, part of this is capturing the imagination, right? And what's great here is you have captured all of, certainly my imagination with your great visions, but it's also showing a path to a product. Unfortunately, we live in an ecosystem that needs to really provide the horsepower. And so Forma is a story, and I'll give you one concrete example where we collaborated with Cancer Research UK, the largest oncology non-for-profit in the UK. And within 6 months, we landed a $200 million deal with Celgene. We followed that up with another deal that if between the two deals, we could deploy well north of $1 billion in the next 7 years into drug discovery. So it is possible. If you can capture the imagination, you can connect exquisite biology to a highly unmet medical need, you can attract the next wave of funding. So it's about creating that catalyst and creating that start of that bridge that someone can see the other side. So I'll stop there, but it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great start. It's fascinating. So Jeff, not even by a mile are you least, even though you're last here. And I frankly don't even know where to start with you, because you've given money, you've raised money, you've taught philanthropy, you have a new book called The Generosity Network. So, open-ended question: what hasn't been said here, and how do you plug into this? How best to plug into this conversation?
Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm an old private equity guy who has gone to the good side, I hope. And so, I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you all. My dad just died on Friday from Alzheimer's and dementia, and so it's a suffering that he's no longer living with, but we want to go after. And I've been spending a lot of my time on that bridging philanthropy to the causes of the day, and working on important causes like malaria with the UN. So I spend about a third of the time on, and spend a lot of time at the Kennedy School thinking about collaborative models around the larger systems. So how do you pull together philanthropists, but all the stakeholders? So whether it's governments, whether it's the NGOs, whether it's foundations and others against the system issue as opposed to the organization. And that's, we all grew up looking at great organizations that we can support, but I think we've grown. And I think that we're now looking at what's the system issue that we can work under to accomplish a goal that's higher than ourselves. And in malaria, I have to give the example, we had a goal over 8 years to lower deaths from malaria from 1 million a year down to 0, and we have that goal as at the end of this year. We're down to below 200,000 deaths a year. But what we did was we built, there's a guy, Ray Chambers, who helped lead it through the MDG Health Alliance and the Secretary General's office. We set 1, a common target, 2, some data to measure access to it, 3, figuring out common issues and common reasons to work together, lowering walls between those donors and the doers. And so it's not just can we apply for money, how can we work with donors that can actually build these relationships so that they're partnerships, so that we can lower not only walls, but increase the network, access to the network. And when you open people's networks to each other, things can happen. And so what is our common objective? Working at something more important than ourselves. It's not to have Save the Children survive. It's not to have the Peace Corps survive. It's actually getting them to work together for malaria. And so as we were doing that, we started looking at what is it? Well, it turns out to be bed nets. That was a technology that we had to spend some time, much easier than the technology that you guys have to work on, trust me. But it was a thing that took 3 years to get agreement around. What are we going to do together? We had to get Sumitomo to actually produce the nets. We had to get this thing called impact investing, which is a new technique that they're keeping talking about as a savior to all, but it isn't. It's a tool to actually build companies that are doing social good. So we did that with Acumen. We got USAID involved, got Gates involved, and so we figured out an ROI. So when you're looking at philanthropy, you want to lay out what's the return on the investment. So with Alzheimer's, it's huge, right? Multiple hundreds of billions of dollars of costs are out there for what kind of investment that can generate this return over a 10-year period. Where for BedNet equivalent, we actually put together the study with McKinsey. It's a 15-to-1 payback ratio. So for $5 BedNet, you get 15 times the return, $75 in GDP impact over a country, over a life of a BedNet through a country's GDP. That unlocked $5 billion of funds from the Global Fund. That unlocked so much money that came out because we had the right consultants doing the right studies, the right plans in each of the countries, local partnerships, and so we have nonprofits, we have for-profits, we have Exxon in because it was the good of their employees, right? So we have government systems, we have research institutions confirming what we have consultants looking at it, but what happened? You need an honest broker to hold those collaborations together. So Ray and company were the collaborative glue that held that together. 2, you need data. What are we doing along the way to make sure we're actually accomplishing something, that you can build confidence in those donors? 3, you need policy change. And so somebody needs to focus on the policy, and no one organization can do that. And so you need a collaboration to do that. 3, and Nancy did an amazing job on communication and awareness. You need a communication and awareness strategy. On malaria, we were in American Idol. We raised awareness for malaria from 30% to over 70% over a year period. All of a sudden, that opened up Congress. Because when we sat and talked to the senators, they were inclined to start allocating more funds. We got it with the President's Malaria Initiative. And so you start working on then that common data. Where's the data you can rely on? That's this independent source of are we actually accomplishing something? So looking at, that's just one example. We have about 40 that we have as cases. This is what the Kennedy School is spending time thinking about, merging this philanthropy strategy along with this action nonprofit strategy to accomplish something that's more important. And so how can we figure out, in this case, I would love to see some solutions or some ideas that we can leave from this panel and say, who are the people? Henry, are you the guy that's going to be the honest broker that was going to come together? Or how are we going to set the 4 people up that can actually start talking to it, the 16 organizations and the corporations that can start to come together for those whiteboard conversations to say, how do we conquer this over the next 10 years? How much money do we need? How many people will we impact? What's the ROI from that model? Who's going to have a consistent data stream?
Jump in, Bill.
Well, I think a core issue turns out to be leverage and return on investment. Most of us have limited amount of time, money, and so the question is, how can you get something much larger than what you can do individually? I've spent the past 9 years with the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, and that's 1,000 scientists at Harvard, and they had an idea about cell biology and about being able to find the recipe to have a cell turn into one of the 200 kinds of cells in the body. In their case, in ALS, for example, they were able to take cells and create the specific motor neurons that are affected by ALS. They were then able to take drug compounds, 10,000 targets, and screen for efficacy. That involves innovations in being able to measure what's going on with those particular brain cells. That's a platform that will affect diabetes and heart disease and other neurodegenerative diseases. So I think we're all looking for where can you put time, effort, and money that will turn out, I think as Stephen said, to be an element of a platform that takes the status quo and blows it up. Because the status quo is just, it's not working.
No, absolutely. I'd like to spin off of that because I really think one of the great successes, if the Ice Bucket Challenge had come out of Madison Avenue, it would not have worked. It's the authenticity of where it came from. It was organic, it had a life, it had a spirit. Not everybody is still familiar about ALS. They know it's a disease because any of the diseases like Alzheimer's where you have stigma, President Reagan, if you look back at 20 years ago, gave it a face. Right. But you never saw the president diminish. So his wife protected her husband and a legacy. So people didn't know. So the idea of coming out, you're really coming out of the shadows of a disease that has been around for a very long time. The opportunity to leverage, in my mind, is to take an issue, a scientific issue, and turn it around or reframe it so you get public engagement. Because like the Parkinson's community, nothing about us without us. Forget that. I mean, that kind of platform doesn't exist. I have found innovation challenges a wonderful way to change a conversation. And there are always 2 conversations. I just ran a challenge, says, does sex matter? I had looked at what happened across cardiovascular disease. We find out that it's one of the biggest killers of women. But we always thought it was a man's disease until they began to look at sex-based differences. So I posed that question in the Alzheimer's space, because statistically, this is the biggest women's issue since breast cancer. We outlive men statistically. We're more prone to get it, but we don't know quite the science. We progress faster into the disease, and 2/3 of caregivers are women. So how did I created an innovation challenge. I framed it to mobilize women, inform the science, and then I drove the teams to say, look, we're in sequester in Washington. There is no money. Don't reinvent the wheel, go mine the public databases. So I was trying to use my dollars in a catalytic way to trigger behaviors and innovation, to get the computer scientists to say, the status quo is unacceptable. Let's mess it up. The Energy Online that you found, we had over 800 open project rooms from 65 countries in 8 weeks. We then stretched it out, and again with communications, Innovation Challenge, you launch it. Then you have finalists. You have multiple times to raise awareness. So again, that's stretching dollars that are very valuable in our space, because I don't have the dollars that Henry has been able to amass. So I leverage everything I can do in a collaborative way and get other people to own it. You have to offer the opportunity to own it.
Sorry for interrupting. On the other side of it, Nancy, I want to talk to you about what you do when your dream comes true and you have all that money. You don't have $1 billion yet, but boy, are you on your way. And I know this is a real issue, and this really comes from a question from the audience, so thank you. I know that we're facing this in a smaller level at your Alzheimer's Fund. We dream of getting a lot of money, and we say, and the scientists tell us, yes, we need billions of dollars, and yes, we know how to spend it. But once you actually have it, making the absolute smartest decision, and no, you're not going to waste $1. Of course, you're taking risks, so you can't know for sure. But what are you doing with that money? How are you deploying it?
That is exactly what everybody in ALS is saying, really, at this point. We didn't have the infrastructure to deal with it. So right now, the ALS Association, who was the default benefactor of the most of that money that came in, we know that everybody's boat rose. So ALS, we're taking baby steps because we really came out from behind the curtain. Right. This disease, when you talk about exactly what you said about Ronald Reagan gave kind of a name to the disease. My husband and I that first night said, we need a Michael J. Fox. Right? We need someone who says, I have ALS. Well, it's funny. The people that we have learned who have died of ALS, who nobody ever really knew how they died. Because ALS is such a humbling and humiliating disease that in the past, the diagnosis was you have ALS, there's nothing we can do, go get your affairs in order. And you only have, this much time left. And so our challenge is that what I say is I really, for my own selfish purposes, wish that there was a phase 3 drug right now that we could throw that $220 million at and bring it right to market, right? We're so not there. So this $220 million worldwide, 115 specifically at the ALS Association, I'm now on the National Board of Trustees because I feel that I want to represent the patients and the caregivers and their families at the table. We're getting they have over 500 RFPs right now because all of a sudden everybody has the cure of ALS. So to wade through all that is going to take time to vet everything correctly and to make sure the money goes to the right place that's going to bring the fastest result. So we're actually so far behind, and when you look at the whole ecosystem, this disease community, this 220 is basically kind of bringing us up to the present. So what happened is a lot of that money right now in a lot of the organizations funded projects that were on the back burner, that were, I know the ALS Association has dispersed $30 million already to grants that were waiting to be funded, but they were all matching grants. So the impact in the community was $60 million.
Wow.
So that's significant. So we look forward to now having our patient community have a voice. People, now they don't have to explain to people what ALS is. I'll just toss out a little stat because I've been the recipient of just some amazing stats. But Google 2014 search, what is what is ALS was the #1 searched phase on Google in 2014. Now, to put that in perspective, the Ice Bucket Challenge started August 1st. So we really only rolled
amazing.
for about 4 months. So, so we know people educated themselves. The other thing is that the patients now, those that weren't sharing as much, are now saying, well, I have ALS. And we're noticing more diagnoses. So the impact of all this, yes, the financial impact, it's just the beginning.
Right.
Because we are still at the bench. We're not, we're still trying to get an at-bat here. And when that happens, believe me, we're gonna keep this ball
So
rolling.
Nancy, you created a movement,
That's
right?
exactly
And I don't know
it.
how many people gave contributions.
Yeah.
It's got to be a huge
Start-
number,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so what are you doing with that? Because what we did, for example, with malaria, we had Nothing But Nets. We had an amazing number of individuals
Yep.
that then all lobbied for more money, that went in and started working with caregivers and issues with people that were working in the local countries, et cetera. So what are you doing? I mean, how can we create the movement, not just for the research that you're going to be putting money into, but
But the patient
the
services
awareness,
and-
the
right.
lobbying, the movement behind it?
Yep, so we are continuing with keeping people accountable in the organizations. What have you done with what you've already raised? Because an interesting part of our movement was at the ALS Association, 55% of the dollars that were raised came from 18 to 30-year-olds. So you talk about a disruptor. That's an enormous disruptor. So now, and I do believe that comes because that was Pat and Pete's peers, right? They're the ones who looked at this and said, oh my God, if this can happen to them, and this is happening to our friends. So we've got to keep them engaged. Well, isn't that the generation of immediate gratification, right? They don't know what it is to wait, right? I know I'm the parent of 3 of them. And so this is something I've been talking to a lot of the organizations about. Yeah, we're coming back at you this August. We absolutely are. And because we don't have the treatment or the cure, and people who now are identifying this journey of an ALS patient and the emotional, the mental, the toll that it takes on the family, on the community, but the financial toll is so. My son lives on machines right now. He is on a ventilator. He speaks through technology. He eats with technology. He moves with technology. He's lifted with technology. He calls himself the bionic man. Well, how do people pay for these things?
Right.
How do people do that? So there's so many facets of our disease. We're going to keep them accountable. We're going to keep the money coming in, but we're also going to, talk to Washington. That's the other piece because of accelerated approvals and things such as that. So there's so many things that we have on our plate. It's almost like we've been reborn, right? This disease has a new birth to it last year, and we're just going to keep that momentum going.
That's fantastic. So Henry, Nancy said something, she was talking about matching grants, and it made me think of the leverage that you were talking about, because I know that Cure Alzheimer's Fund, one of their goals, and in fact this has now happened several times, you also talked about how ambitious you were, taking that 20-yard pass, or maybe sometimes it's the 80-yard pass, and you want to convert something really aggressive and out there and leverage, maybe $500,000 or a couple $100,000 of research into something much larger. Can you give an example of that?
Sure. I mean, one of the big I'm a layman in a scientific meeting, by and large. I'm comforted by most of, except for David, I'm comforted by most of my fellow panelists here. But one of the real challenges when you're taking on a disease as difficult as Alzheimer's and you're trying to raise money is how do you tell your investor, your partner, that you're making a return on the investment? And I have 2 or 3 different answers to that. And one is what you just alluded to, which is if some of our higher risk projects are successful, then by definition the project gets de-risked to a degree. And we have several examples where some of our researchers that we funded initially have now been able to go back to the NIH or other more risk-averse sources to get follow-on funding. That's a model that's used every day, as Bill Salmon knows, in the venture capital business. A Series A is followed by a Series B and a Series C. So probably in our most specific example of that, Cure Alzheimer's Fund funded a gamma secretase inhibitor, which Rudy Tanzi and Steve Wagner at the University of California, San Diego have worked on. That was then able to win several years ago a very competitive so-called blueprint grant from the NIH, where the NIH is taking that therapeutic candidate into preclinical trials, and we hopefully are going to be in a position to go into clinical trials within a year. So that is leverage where we got probably on the order of 3 or 4 times the initial dollars in the follow-on funding. A second example of metrics or success, and these are fuzzy, I'm the first to admit, is that our small group, maybe 15 to 20 primary researchers, have published in the less than 10 years over 160 peer-reviewed papers on Alzheimer's disease research. And perhaps more importantly, those papers have then been cited, the citations from those papers have exceeded 7,600 in a very short period of time. It says to me that the quality of the research that we have garnered by backing some of the very best in the field is indeed being recognized and moving the understanding of the paradigm of this disease forward. In fact, I was so gratified by Tanzi's panel this morning where he had 5 of industry and academic leaders talking about their understanding of the disease today. First of all, Cure Alzheimer's had funded 3 of those researchers, but more importantly, I asked him afterwards, could that panel have sat on the stage 2 years ago and had the agreement that we saw this morning? And his answer was no. It's that kind of progress that allows you to get follow-on leverage. And I would end with the following comment. I'm going back in history here. The initial Greylock Partners #1 fund in 1969 was for the princely sum of $10 million. Today, there are 20 or 30 premier venture capital firms in the country that close off $1 billion funds every time they go out and do fundraising. Success will find you if you produce a record of success.
Go ahead, Bill.
But I want to come back to this issue of movement and who we're trying to move. So Newt Gingrich had an article, an editorial. For many people, it was the first thing he'd ever written that people agreed with. But in point of fact, the level of funding for diseases like Alzheimer's is criminal. We have a cost to the system, not including the cost and implications for the people who are, as Meryl says, co-diagnosed with the disease effectively. We have 200 billion plus costs growing at 7 or 10% per year. If you had that cost in business, you would be willing to spend tens or hundreds of billions to eliminate it. And the NIH spends $1 billion or less. And frankly, we should all be angry about that. We should be angry not because it's going to affect us, but it will affect our grandchildren. And we shouldn't, as a country, not invest, because the biggest cost will turn out to be the bright young people who decide to get out of research because they can't get funding, and the ideas that will not be carried forward. And that's the tax that I think exceeds almost any tax we've ever talked about.
So aside from awareness, Bill, which Nancy's been speaking to so eloquently, what can we, in these innovative ways, do about that problem? Or are we maybe, I hate to say it, are we maybe contributing to that problem in the sense that the government is seeing all these innovative things happening in the private sector with these public-private partnerships, and so they're saying, look, you know, all this innovative research is happening. We don't need to do more than we're doing.
So across the entire country, you're seeing not-for-profits engage in things like foster care and be more efficient than a government model. Social impact bonds may be a way to free up private capital. But here's the point. You need government funding of basic science. It's very difficult to see exactly what comes out of basic science, but the reality is, without that funding, a lot of what we've talked about yesterday, today, and tomorrow is simply not possible. It's simply not possible. And so I think we have to get angry as citizens. Meryl, are you angry?
We don't have enough time. But that lack of anger, the natural advocate would be the caregiver, but they're on the front lines of their care. So it's really our children, our adult children, who need to get angry. The most promising study that I saw was out of Merrill Lynch and AgeWave that said millennials are now as concerned about Alzheimer's as they are about any other disease, because they are now watching their parents take care of their parents and worried about what it's doing to them financially, emotionally, and seeing their parents. So they're witness to the future, which is where I was 20 years ago when I saw it young, and I became terrified for all of us. But it is that stepping out and together saying this is unacceptable. It's a legacy issue for everybody on this panel that has a touch of gray or no hair. You know, this is a legacy issue for our generation, and we have to own it. When governments from China, Japan, more adult diapers are sold in Japan than baby diapers. Now, part of that's a societal, cultural issue, but this is big in Europe, even in developing countries. We have met our match with this disease. So I believe we have to leverage everything we can.
It seems to me that there's a great opportunity, I mean, Henry, on Alzheimer's to start unifying people around the fact that at some age you will get it. Right. And that this is not if, this is as we're aging society. And I give you the example, one of the good things that came out, the only good thing maybe that came out of the pandemic of Ebola was that everyone knew they were vulnerable. So somebody in Dallas, Texas is vulnerable. And so we actually now have hundreds of $millions of coming out of World Bank, for example, World Bank bonds to rebuild Liberia's health system, because unless there's a viable health system in 193 countries, we're all vulnerable. Well, why aren't we going down that path with Alzheimer's saying, you're gonna get it? So this is the issue that we all have to start working for, and every caregiver's suffering. They have PTSD because they're suffering for decades, you know, trying to help people. Why aren't we starting to rally that group of people that you've already started with the ALS group, you know, around the Alzheimer's issue?
I think there is a unique opportunity now. If a conversation isn't working, you change it. So now if we move it down to what I call a safe zone, pre-disease, that doesn't have the baggage of stigma or ageism, just smart to have your brain baseline. It's the part that's missing from our health records. We do it for our kids, concussion from sports. So all of a sudden we've taken it away. Go to the young men and women with post-traumatic stress from the war. We owe them a future. That's apolitical. We owe them a future. It's all about the brain. So if we can broaden that, that's where I think we're going to have our opportunity, because trust me, right below the surface, the stigma exists.
So brain health.
Well, move it to brain health, flip it, and move it to that space and say, we should all be tracking. And now, our catalytic philanthropy goes into the mobile health space. Passive tracking with your phone, smartphones. I'm willing to make an investment in the validation of mobile apps so that we can make cognitive assessments and begin to get a Framingham version in the brain space. We don't have that part, and it's been missing from health records.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of leverage, right? Because what we have in social media today is really a willingness to share, right? And I like the point of the children are the ones who could actually see in their lifetime the chance that this could change, as opposed, and in diseases like Alzheimer's, you know, if you thought about running, going back to the Framingham Heart Study, Lipitor and the cholesterol lowering drugs, which is now the reason that we're getting, you know, we're living long enough because we're not dying at 62 of a heart attack anymore. That was 17,000 patients followed for decades. And only there did you have a surrogate biomarker of cholesterol lowering. If you had to run a Lipitor trial where you waited for men of 40 years old to see whether they had a heart attack at 62 or 72, the drug would never get, and that's where we are today with Alzheimer's, right? So part of what we can really do to catalyze change is leverage the power of your massive networks in whatever disease state it is to define a path, get in front of the FDA and say, look, it's not acceptable that we can't go into early onset. You know, the Columbia trial is a great example of that, but that's a 6-year study in 300 patients at $100 million. But that will define, but as we understand the rate of disease progression, that we have surrogate markers that the FDA will say, I will give you a breakthrough designation if you can show me a change in cognitive decline on an iPhone app, right? Define what that is for me, and I will define for you a $1 billion opportunity that a big pharma will suddenly open their eyes and say, this is where we can take it. And it's that power of everyone thinking about how you change those barriers to entry, and then the financial return. You don't need to be an economist to figure out that if you had a drug for Alzheimer's or ALS or any other drug, right? My founder is one of the people behind Genzyme. They found a way to make a lot of money off of very small disease populations. There is an economic system. We need a path with clarity to getting there, and we need the biology to support it.
But the communication that Nancy has so effectively described is really, if we knew by that simple action that we could accelerate research, how many of us would step up and do it? A data dump for science, or the fact that we're wearing the data dump on our hip. I mean, we're surgically attached to our phones. So how do we maximize that use? I do see a disconnect between academic science and technology, and have tried to get to the technology groups and say, look at an endpoint and make a run for it.
Bill,
They're
do you wanna
waiting on
speak to that?
validation, and I think there's why is there the disconnect, Bill?
Yeah, and what can you do about it?
Am I supposed to represent?
Yeah, you have all the answers.
You have all
Our
the answers directed at you
You're
right
from
now.
Harvard, right?
I'm from Harvard, yeah. Harvard's at the center of this. Look, we have disconnects everywhere. Some of what you all are describing, the fact that we throw away petabytes of data every day. We do it partly in the name of protecting privacy, which I think is bullshit.
Yeah.
That's a technical term. We use that at Harvard. But the
tell my kids that.
reality is to try to measure cognition over time, to catch all of these diseases earlier, to find biomarkers, to invest more in diagnostics than we've been willing to invest. Frankly, I think all of the system is not working as effectively as it needs to work. And that's where you all have come in. That's where disease-focused organizations are playing the most critical role, I find, in the economy today. Remember that if we were at an oncology conference, we would be talking about cancer as a chronic disease. We would be talking about not something that is debilitating at the level of Alzheimer's or ALS or Parkinson's. We'd be talking about something that, in a sense, goes into remission or we can deal with. This is the problem. This is the health problem of our age.
Right.
And so we need far more people to focus on it in all aspects. We need academics to work with biotech companies, to work with pharma. We need the NIH and the FDA and CMS to all work collectively. We have a system in which the unfunded liability in Medicare today is $36 trillion. That is 2.5 times the amount of debt that we acknowledge. And that's going to get worse as a result of these diseases that are going to affect millions of people and their loved ones. So I think we're at a point where we need a revolution. What Nancy did, I think, is to provoke people to care and to give. But we need that at a scale that is far greater than what we've been able to do.
I think the vulnerability was another piece of our puzzle. Because in ALS, it's called sporadic ALS. And Pete, to his peer group, was a physical specimen.
Yeah.
And I think that that vulnerability was a part of, well, if this happened to him,
Could happen to me.
it can happen to me. So I totally agree with that piece, because I think our movement definitely justified that thought, because I know that was a piece of it.
So action items for the room, and let's try to have a couple of short answers here if we can. We need this revolution.
Yes.
Do we need people to do we need 100 or 500 Nancy Frades, or Bill? What's your action item for people in this room? What do you want them to do most coming out of this session?
I'd like to take a cattle prod to Washington. You know, the reality is people talk about the projects where someone measured frog sex lives, and they use that to diminish all that's taking place. If I look at Rudy Tanzi and Doug Melton and all of the people who've been represented here, if people understood how hard they worked and how much of their time they spent begging for dollars, they would be horrified, because what it means, it's time taken away from the thing that we all aspire to have. So for me, you just need someone who's going to shake everyone and say, this is not a Republican problem, this is not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem, this is a problem for every one of us. Even if we're not going to be affected by the disease, someone we know will be, and it will impact us all.
Henry, given a choice, A or B, you're speaking to this room and you have one action item. Is it learn more about Cure Alzheimer's Fund and trust us and give us money? Or is it go start your own, find your project and mimic what we've done in terms of principles?
I'm all for both. I mean, I really am. The fact of the matter is that there's a lot of collaboration that needs and can go on between these various diseases. And we've worked, some of our researchers worked with ALS research, with MS research,
Diabetes,
Parkinson's,
yep.
and diabetes. So I think that other disease-specific nonprofits that use a model or a variation of the model that we've tried to implement, I'm all for, and I would applaud them happening. And I'd like to see us scale our model as well. I mean, it's all of the above.
Meryl, action item.
I'd like us all to become citizen scientists. I don't think the general public respects the timelines of science, understands what it takes. I think the pharmaceutical companies do not deserve the beating that they get out of Washington classically. But again, I think that it's the disconnect. And the more you engage us, the earlier on, and let us help you design the trials and be engaged, you are going to have advocates that say, don't take that money away from our researchers. We will be at the steps of Congress. How dare you take money away from the National Institute of Health? Right now, the steps are empty. So I think we really have to think of creative ways to engage. You know, it is easier to get to Mars than to find a cure for Alzheimer's. To get to Mars, it's a 50-50 shot, and we all know what the shot is for Alzheimer's. So it takes leadership. People in the pharmaceutical companies, they bet their careers on the chance that they might come up with a disease-modifying drug. People need to understand that you go to the front line every day with us. And I think we just need to join forces earlier in the process.
Nancy, to you, a real quick answer, if you can, about what you want to see that isn't.
When a situation confronts you that you deem unacceptable, dig down as deep as you can and find your best mother bear and go after it.
Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, I think the thing as an entrepreneur and in the biotech space is take the level of inspiration and passion you see on this panel here and channel that into building great companies and doing great things. And if you could harness that passion where you have the tools to actually make the drugs, it will come. These things will fall.
And Jeff.
And I wouldn't just give the money to Henry, and I wouldn't just have everybody go out and do their own thing. There's a collaborative opportunity here where everybody in a whiteboarded room can say, what are we going to do on policy change? What are we going to do in awareness? And what can we do together to achieve what we need to do, whether it's setting up a Gavi equivalent, or whether it's setting up NIH and unlocking a lot of money, or whether it's going after 10 senators who are the key and making sure that they release funds.
Amen.
Thank you. Well, this is, I had high expectations, and I think we've exceeded that. It's been a tremendous discussion. Thank you all for being a part of this, and thanks for being with us.